They pitied her. All night, the whispers followed Luciana Sheridan around that wedding, a broke ICU nurse from the Bronx, handed over to settle a debt that was never hers, married off to a man the whole city was afraid of. Everyone in New York had heard the rumors about Graham Marchetti, 37 years old, head of the most dangerous family on the East Coast, and in 22 years, nobody had ever seen him take a woman's arm, shake a man's hand, or let a single person get close enough to touch him. They said he didn't want women. They said it behind their glasses, smiling, certain. So Luciana walked into that marriage expecting exactly what they'd promised her. A locked door, a cold house on a cliff above the Hudson, and a husband who wouldn't look at her once. She'd made her peace with it. But that night, when the heavy bedroom door at Ironwood clicked shut behind them, what Graham Marchetti did next shattered every rumor in that city and left the woman who hadn't let anyone in for 8 years completely undone. If you love stories about dignity and the truth hiding underneath what people say about us, go ahead and hit that like button. Share it with someone who's ever been judged for something that wasn't true. And if you're new here, subscribe. We tell one of these every week. Now, let's go back to that night at Ironwood and find out what really happened behind that door. She sat on the edge of a bed that wasn't hers, in a room she'd walked into for the first time that afternoon, still wearing the dress somebody else had paid for. The house made no sound. That was the part she hadn't been ready for. In the Bronx, there was always something. A siren 4 blocks over, a neighbor's television through the wall, the radiator knocking like somebody trapped inside it. Here there was only the wind coming off the water and the long, patient silence of stone. She'd counted the whole thing out in her head on the drive up, the way she counted everything, and the arithmetic had comforted her. 2 years, 730 nights. She could do 730 of anything. She'd done worse math than that in worse rooms. And then the floorboards told on him. Somebody was in the hallway. The steps were unhurried, heavy, and they stopped directly outside her door. And they stayed stopped. And Luciana understood that whoever was standing out there was standing there deciding something. She didn't move. She put her hands flat on her knees the way she did before she walked into a room where a family was about to be told bad news. And she made her face into the face she wore at work, the calm one, the one that gave nothing away. The brass knob turned. To understand what happened when that door opened, you have to go back 6 weeks. 6 weeks earlier, she was in the intensive care unit of a public hospital in the Bronx, at 3 in the morning, 4th double shift of the week, on hour 11, with a 22-year-old on the bed in front of her, who had gone gray in the time it took her to cross the room, found down in a stairwell, brought in by a friend who wouldn't give a last name, and then left. Respirations 4, then 3, then nothing you could really call breathing. Luciana had the bag mask on him before the resident cleared the doorway. 2 fingers under the jaw. Seal tight, squeezing slow. She called for naloxone, and she called the dose, and she didn't raise her voice once, because the trick nobody teaches you in school is that a quiet voice moves a room faster than a loud one. Sats fell to 71. She kept bagging. Somebody got the line in. She pushed it, and then she did the hardest part of the job, which is wait. Which is stand there with your hand on a stranger's chest, counting his heartbeat against your own, while the drug goes looking for him. 40 seconds, 60, and then a shudder, and a gasp that sounded like a man coming up out of deep water, and his eyes came open, terrified and furious and alive. He tried to swing at her. They always did. She stepped back easy, out of range, and she said, "You're okay. You're in the hospital." And she waited for his hands to come down. 91%, 94. The resident let out a breath and said, "Nice," and went to write it up, and that was that. And by the time Luciana got back to the station, the coffee she'd poured at midnight had gone cold in the same spot she'd left it. She drank it anyway. She was 27 years old, and she made more money than she'd ever thought she would, and she had $11 in her checking account. There was a way that happened to a person. It happened in pieces so reasonable that you couldn't point to the one that did it. It was the balance still sitting on her mother's account, 4 years after her mother had stopped needing anything, because the hospital had billed and the insurance had paid a portion, and the portion left over had a way of following you around. It was Danny's medications, and the copay on each one, and the things his plan called optional that his cardiologist called necessary, and the difference between those 2 words was about $900 a month. It was the 12 miles between his apartment and the clinic that took the good insurance. And it was 3 separate nights in 4 years when her father had called her sounding like a man standing on a ledge, and she had covered him, and told nobody, not even Danny, especially not Danny. 1900 the first time, 4000 the second, 6 the last. She had told herself each of those times that it was the last, and she had believed it, and she'd been wrong. And the being wrong was the part she couldn't forgive in herself, not in him. Her phone was face down in her locker where she always left it. She checked it at 4:20 in the morning, standing in the break room with her back against the wall, eating crackers because she hadn't eaten. 1 missed call, 9 minutes long, which meant he'd been talking to her voicemail until it cut him off. And her father never talked that long unless something had already happened. She looked at the screen for a while, then she put the phone in her pocket, and she went back out onto the floor. And she finished her shift, because there were 9 more hours of people who needed her, and exactly 0 of them had done anything to deserve what was waiting for her at the end of it. He was in the back booth of an all-night place on White Plains Road when she got there, a little after 8 in the morning, still in her scrubs because she hadn't gone home first. Her father had ordered coffee for both of them and hadn't touched his. He looked smaller than the last time. That was the first thing she noticed, and the thing she'd think about later, how a man could lose size without losing weight. Frank Sheridan was 58 years old, and he had the kind of face that used to open doors for him, and it still worked a little, on waitresses, on strangers, on his own daughter for longer than she wanted to admit. He said, "You look tired, sweetheart." She said, "I'm at hour 13. What's the number?" He started to say something about how he wanted to explain, how it wasn't as simple as a number, and she put her hand flat on the table. Not hard, just flat, the way you steady a tray, and she said again, "What's the number?" So he told her, 200,000. That was the part he'd actually lost. 4 years ago, a stretch of Sundays that went wrong, and then a Monday he tried to fix them on, and then it was done, and he'd told nobody, and he'd kept going because a man in a hole keeps digging on the theory that eventually he'll come out the other side. She sat with that. 200,000 was a house. It was terrible, but it was a shape she could hold in her mind. And then he said the second part, and he said it fast, the way you pull a bandage. With what's on it now, it's 840. She heard herself ask him to say it again. He said it again. $840,000. The waitress came by with the pot, and Luciana put her hand over her cup and smiled at her. Actually smiled, because that was what she did, and waited until the woman had gone. Then she said, "Who holds it?" And her father looked out the window at the traffic on the avenue and didn't answer. And that was the answer. It wasn't a bank. Banks send letters. Banks put it on your credit, and your credit follows you around like a bad smell for 7 years, and then it dies. Banks don't compound a debt to 4 times its size in 4 years, because there isn't a lawful rate on this earth that does that. She'd known before, she asked. She'd known in the parking lot. She'd known, if she was honest, since the 9-minute voicemail. He said, "I've been paying on it, Lucy. Every week. I've been paying." She said, "Paying what? The interest?" He didn't answer that either, and she felt something in her chest go very quiet and very cold. The same thing that happened when a monitor started to change, and nobody else had noticed yet. She said, "I have $11. He said, "I'm not asking you for money." She said, "Then what are you asking me for?" And her father, who had never in his life been able to hold her eyes when it mattered, held them. He said, "They know about Danny." 3 words, and the whole booth tilted. She kept her face still. That was the training. You keep your face still, because the second your face moves, the family in front of you starts screaming, and once they start, you lose them. She said, "What does that mean, they know about Danny?" And Frank said, "It means somebody asked me how the boy was doing. That's all. Somebody asked." She stood up. She put a 10 on the table for 2 coffees that neither of them drank, because she was not going to be a woman who walked out on a check, and she said, "Don't call him. Don't call him. Don't go see him. Don't stand outside his building. Don't send him anything on his birthday." And Frank said her name once. She said, "I'm not doing this, Dad. Whatever it is you drove here to ask me, I'm not doing it." And then she walked out into a morning that had turned bright and ordinary while she wasn't looking, and she drove home with the radio off, and she went up the 4 flights to her apartment with her keys already in her hand. There was an envelope in her door, not under it, wedged into the frame at eye level, at the exact height a person would look, so that she couldn't have missed it and couldn't have pretended she had. Plain manila. Her name wasn't on it. Nothing was on it. She stood in the hallway with her thumb under the flap for longer than she'd like to say, and then she opened it, and what came out into her hands was paper she recognized before she could read it, because she'd read 1,000 pages like it in her working life. It was Danny's transplant workup. His name, his date of birth, his blood type, his ejection fraction, his listing date, his status, photocopied clean and square, the way you copy something in an office, not the way you photograph something you've stolen in a hurry. And on the last page, in the margin, in blue ballpoint, somebody had written a single number, his position on the waiting list. That was all. No letter, no demand, no signature, no phone number, no instruction. Not one word in the entire envelope that a person could have carried into a police station and set down on a desk and called a threat. She read it 4 times, standing up. Then she sat down on the floor of her own hallway, with her back against the door she hadn't opened yet, and she understood that she had already lost, and that whoever had put that envelope there had known she'd understand. The call came 2 days later, from a number that didn't ring twice, and a voice she'd never heard gave her an address on Mulberry Street and a time, 10 o'clock at night, and said the door would be unlocked. It was a restaurant that had closed for the evening, chairs up on half the tables, one lamp burning at the back. There was a man by the door who didn't ask her name and didn't search her and didn't need to. And there was a man at the back table, alone, with a folder squared in front of him and nothing else. He didn't stand up when she came in. He said, "Miss Sheridan, sit down." She sat. Graham Marchetti was 37 years old and looked like a man who slept badly and had made his peace with it. Dark suit, no tie, gray coming in early at the temples. He was wearing gloves, thin black leather, indoors, at a table, with a folder in front of him, and he made no move to take them off, and no comment about them. And Luciana noticed and filed it, and said nothing, because she'd spent 9 years learning that you don't ask a person about the thing they're not mentioning until you know why they're not mentioning it. He opened the folder. He didn't make small talk. He didn't ask if she'd like anything. He said, "I'm going to tell you what I'm offering. Don't answer until I'm finished." Then he read it out the way a man reads terms, flat, in order. One item, and then the next. 2 years of marriage. Legal, registered, public. She'd live at the house upstate. At the end of the 2nd year, either party could file, and there'd be no contest and no argument. On the day she signed, the debt her father owed would be closed. Not paid down, not restructured, closed, and the paper it lived on destroyed, and the men who held it told to their faces that it no longer existed. Her brother would be transferred to the cardiac program at the best transplant center in the state, admitted under a private funding arrangement. Every dollar covered, medications, transportation, the follow-up care for the rest of his life if it came to that. And on the last day of the 2nd year, she'd receive $2 million, and she could take it and go anywhere on this earth she wanted to go, and he would never contact her again. He closed the folder. He said, "That's all of it." And Luciana sat there in a dark restaurant at 10 at night and discovered that the thing she felt wasn't relief and wasn't fear. It was the flat, level calm she felt at the foot of a bed when the numbers were bad. The calm that came right before she started to work. She said, "Why me?" He looked at her then, properly, for the first time since she'd walked in. He said, "Because you looked at me, and you weren't afraid, and you weren't curious either." She said, "When?" And he said, "You'll find out." And that was the only crooked thing he said all night. And it went by so fast she almost let it go. Almost. She said, "I've heard the rumors about you. Everybody has." She said it plainly, without dressing it up, without apology. The way she'd ask a patient a question there was no polite version of, and Graham Marchetti didn't blink, and didn't stiffen, and didn't correct her. He didn't say a word. He let it sit there on the table between them, and after a moment he said, "Does that change your answer?" And she understood, watching him, that a man who wanted to deny something would have denied it, and that a man who was ashamed of something would have looked away. And he'd done neither, and she didn't know yet what that meant, but she knew it meant something. She said, "It makes it easier." He almost smiled. It didn't reach anything. He said, "Most people say the opposite." Then he took a pen out of his coat and set it on the folder and slid it across the table toward her. And he pulled his hand back before she reached for it. Well back, And she noticed that too. Luciana looked at the pen for a long time. She thought about $11. She thought about a photocopy in a manila envelope with a number written in the margin in blue ballpoint. She thought about her mother in a bed in the same hospital where she now worked, saying, "Take care of your brother," and about how there'd never been a version of her life where she said no to that. She thought about the fact that this man had not once, in the entire conversation, tried to make her feel better about it. He hadn't called it an arrangement between friends. He hadn't told her she'd come to like the house. He'd read her the terms of the worst night of her life like a delivery schedule, and somehow that was the only reason she trusted a single word of it. She said, "I have conditions." He said, "Name them." She said, "My brother gets moved before I sign anything, not the day after, before, and nobody ever speaks to my father again, in any way, for any reason, including me." Graham Marchetti considered that for about 4 seconds. Then he said, "Done," and he said it like a man closing a door. She picked up the pen and she signed her name on the line, and her hand didn't shake, and she was almost sorry about that. She told Danny on a Tuesday, sitting on the end of his bed with her back against the wall and her feet up, the way she'd sat there since he was 8 years old, and she was 19, and their mother had been dead for 11 days. He was 16 now. He had their mother's mouth and their father's terrible gift for reading a room, and he'd been sick long enough to have stopped being polite about it. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which should have warned her. Then he said, "Say the part about the money again." She said, "There isn't a part about money." He said, "Lucy, there's always a part about money." So she gave him the version she'd built in the car on the way over, the clean one, the one with the corners sanded off, a man she'd met through work. Older, private, a marriage that was mostly on paper, arranged for reasons of his own that were nobody's business, and in exchange, resources. She used that word, resources. She heard herself use it, and hated it. Danny let her finish. Then he said, "Is Dad in this?" And she didn't answer fast enough. 16 years old, oxygen tubing looped over his ears, and he closed his eyes for a second like a man taking a punch he'd seen coming from across the room. He said, "Don't do it." He said, "I'd rather stay on the list. I'd rather wait my turn like everybody else and see what happens. Don't sell yourself for me. I'm not worth it." And she said, "Don't you ever say that again?" And it came out harder than she meant it. They sat there. The radiator knocked. He said, quieter, "You already signed it, didn't you?" She said yes, and Danny turned his head and looked at the wall, and she watched him decide not to cry in front of her, which was the single worst thing she'd ever had to watch. Worse than the machines. Worse than any of it. He said, "Then I'm going to get better." He said it like a threat. She said, "That's the plan." She didn't tell him the rest. She didn't tell him about the envelope wedged in her door at eye level, or the number in the margin in blue ballpoint, and she never would, not that year and not the next one, because there are things you carry so that the person you love gets to keep breathing without knowing what the air cost. The fitting started that Friday, at a place off Madison where nobody used a price tag, and Luciana stood on a low platform for 2 hours, while a woman with pins in her mouth worked around her hem. She wasn't alone. There were 4 or 5 of them there, wives and daughters of men whose names she was only beginning to learn, and they'd come to be helpful. And they were, in the way weather is helpful. One of them touched her wrist and said, "You poor thing, you must be terrified." Another said her cousin had married into something similar, and it had worked out beautifully, considering. And then the youngest one, 22 maybe, sitting sideways in a chair with a glass of something in her hand, said, "Well, at least you'll have the house to yourself, because he keeps his own company, doesn't he?" And a second woman said the name, Julian Bright, the way you set down a card you've been holding all night, lightly, smiling, and the room went warm and knowing, and every eye came to Luciana to watch what she'd do with it. She stood on the platform with a stranger's pins in her hem and heard her own voice come out flat and cold. She said, "I've been in rooms where people were dying. Nobody in those rooms ever talked like this." Then she said, "I'd like to finish the hem." Nobody said anything for a while after that. The woman with the pins worked faster. And what Luciana couldn't account for, then or later that night, was why she'd done it. She owed Graham Marchetti nothing. He'd bought 2 years of her life across a table in a closed restaurant and hadn't pretended otherwise. She should have let them talk. She'd let people talk about worse, but something about the shape of it had turned her stomach. 6 women in a beautiful room deciding what a man was based on nothing at all, when she'd spent 9 years learning that you don't get to say what's wrong with somebody until you've actually looked. That was all. She told herself that was all. She was still telling herself when a man came in through the front with 2 coffees and a bakery box and filled the doorway like an uncle at a christening. He was in his 50s, heavy-set, gray, with a laugh you could hear from the street. He put the box down on the counter without asking anyone and said, "They don't feed you in these places. It's criminal." And the room lit up for him. He came across and took Luciana's hand in both of his, and he said, "So you're her." He said, "I'm Salvatore Renzi. I'm his uncle, more or less. The family's complicated." And then he looked at her for a moment with real kindness in his face, and he said, "Sweetheart, whatever anybody's told you about that boy, he's had a hard road, and he doesn't let people carry it with him. You be patient with him, and if you need anything at all, you call me first, not him." He kissed her on the cheek like family, and he called her daughter. And Luciana Sheridan, who hadn't had anybody offer her a thing in 8 years, felt her throat close up and thought, with something close to gratitude, that at least there was one decent man in all of this. The package came on a Thursday, left with the super, and carried up 4 flights by a boy from the building who wouldn't take a tip. Flat, brown, about the size of a cutting board, heavier than it looked. She opened it standing at the counter with her coat still on. No flowers, no box from a jeweler with a name stamped in gold on the lid. Inside, there was a plain folder, and inside the folder was a letter from the graduate nursing program she'd left 3 years ago, on letterhead, addressed to her, informing Miss Luciana Sheridan that her application for readmission had been approved and her place held for the fall term. Behind it was the financial page, tuition, fees, clinical placement costs, the whole schedule of it laid out line by line, and in the column on the right, beside every one, the same 3 words, paid in full, not deferred, not financed, not a promissory anything, paid, and tucked inside the front cover, on a small square of paper, in handwriting that was sharp and fast and slanted hard to the right, 4 sentences. You said you stopped. Nobody should have to stop doing the thing they're good at. The seat is yours, whether or not you take it. It has nothing to do with our arrangement. Luciana stood there and read it maybe 6 times, and then she put her hand flat on the counter because her legs had gone strange under her, and she went looking through the last few weeks for where he could possibly have gotten it. There'd been one conversation. One, in a lawyer's conference room downtown, the 2 attorneys going line by line through the prenuptial agreement. Her own lawyer, hired for her, paid for by the other side but genuinely hers, arguing points on her behalf that she hadn't thought to ask for. It had gone on for 2 hours. At some point somebody had asked what she did, to fill in a form, and she'd said intensive care nurse, and the man had asked if she had a graduate degree, and she'd said, "I was in a nurse practitioner program. I got through 5 semesters," and then she'd said, "I stopped." That was the whole of it. 6 words, maybe 7, said toward the middle of a table to nobody in particular, and Graham Marchetti had been standing at the window, at the far end of that room, with his back to all of them, and his gloved hands behind him, looking down at the traffic on Church Street, and he hadn't turned around and hadn't said anything, and she'd assumed, without ever really thinking about it, that he wasn't listening. She'd have bet money on it. She'd have bet the $11, and now here was the folder on her counter, with her name on the letterhead and every line paid, and she found she could not get her breath quite right, and she didn't cry, because she hadn't done that in 8 years, and wasn't about to start over a piece of paper from a registrar's office. But she sat down on the kitchen floor with the folder in her lap, the way she'd sat down in the hallway with the envelope. And she thought, that's twice now that a man has left something for me to find, and this is what it costs to tell the difference. The rest went the way the paperwork said it would. They took the license out at the city clerk's office on a Monday morning, and there was a waiting period of 24 hours before anyone could marry them, which struck her as the only sensible law she'd encountered in the whole business. 1 full day for a person to change her mind. She didn't change it. The prenuptial agreement was signed the same afternoon, her attorney beside her, his attorney across, both of them initialing every page, and she read all of it herself, all 40 pages, out loud in her head, because nobody was ever going to be able to tell her she hadn't known what she was signing. On Wednesday, a car came for her at 7 in the morning, and drove north out of the city for a little over an hour, up along the river, and the road climbed, and then there were gates, and then there was the house on the cliff, gray stone and narrow windows, standing there over the water like something that had grown up out of the ground instead of being built on it. Ironwood. She'd never seen it before that day. The ceremony took 11 minutes. There was a judge, and Sal, and 2 men she didn't know, and the housekeeper, a woman of about 63 named Adelaide Kerr, who watched the whole thing with her hands folded and her face giving away nothing at all. Graham stood beside her in a dark suit and gloves and said the words in a steady voice, the way he said everything. And when it came time, he took her hand for the ring, and his hand was cold through the leather, and he let go the moment it was done. He didn't look at her. Not once. Not through any of it. Not when the judge said husband and wife. Not when Sal clapped him on the back and laughed and said something about time, and Luciana saw him go rigid at the contact and cover it in half a second. And she filed that too. There was no reception. By 9 o'clock that night, the house had emptied out and gone quiet in a way she hadn't known a house could. Adelaide showed her up. The room was at the end of the east hall, enormous, with a fire already going, and her one suitcase set neatly by the closet, and the woman said good night, ma'am, and went out, and the heavy door swung shut behind her, and Luciana Sheridan sat down on the edge of a bed that wasn't hers. The knob turned, and stopped, and turned back. Then he knocked. Twice, not hard. And Luciana understood that a man who had opened the door first and knocked second had done it in that order on purpose, so that she'd know he could have come in and hadn't. She said, "It's open." Graham stood in the doorway without crossing it. He'd taken off the jacket. He still had the gloves on. He said, "I'm not coming in unless you tell me to." She said, "Then you'd better tell me what this is." And he said, "The door doesn't lock from the outside. It locks from the inside. You can turn it, and nobody in this house will ever ask you why, and nobody will ever knock on it again. That's what I came to say." She sat with that a moment. Then she said, "Come in." He came in and stopped about 10 feet away, near the fireplace, and didn't sit. Luciana looked at him standing there in the middle of an enormous room, keeping the distance of a man in an elevator with a stranger, and she thought about 6 women in a fitting room deciding what he was, and she decided she'd rather be wrong out loud than right in her own head. She said, "I'm going to ask you the question I asked you in the restaurant, and this time I'd like an answer." He said, "I know what you're going to ask." She said, "Ask it anyway." And so she said it. "They say you don't want women. They say it about you the way they'd say you were left-handed. And you didn't deny it in front of me. And you didn't deny it to those women. And you've been letting them say it for years. Why?" He was quiet for long enough that she heard the fire settle. Then he said, "Because part of it's true, and I'd rather they had the wrong part than the right one." She said, "Which part?" And Graham Marchetti said, "I don't find women disgusting. I've never found a woman disgusting in my life." He said, "I can't be touched. By anyone." And he said it in exactly the flat voice he'd used to read out the terms of the marriage, one item and then the next. And that was how she knew it wasn't a line. She said, "By anyone." He said, "Anyone. Men, women, doctors, barbers, my own uncle, a stranger on a train." He said, "If a hand comes at me and I haven't watched it the whole way in, something happens that I don't control and can't explain, and I've had 22 years to find a way around it and I haven't." He said, "That's the whole of it. That's the great mystery of me." And then, after a beat, in a voice she hadn't heard from him yet, he said, "You're the first person I've said that sentence to who's a stranger." She said, "I'm not a stranger. I'm your wife." And Graham said, "As of 11 o'clock this morning, which is worse." And Luciana laughed. It came out of her before she could stop it. One short, surprised sound in a room that hadn't heard a laugh in years, and something in his shoulders came down half an inch. There was whiskey in the cabinet by the window. She poured 2, because she didn't know what else to do with her hands, and she set his down on the table nearest him and stepped back before he reached for it, and he noticed her do that, and something crossed his face that she couldn't name. They drank. She said, "My mother died 8 years ago in the same hospital I work in now, 2 floors down from my unit. I go past that room 4 nights a week." She said, "I've never told anybody that either." He said, "Why not?" She said, "Because everybody wants to say something after, and there isn't anything to say, and I'd rather they didn't." He nodded once, like a man agreeing to a term in a contract. He said, "My brother's name was Matteo." She said, "I know." He said, "No, you don't. You know he's dead. That's different." And he didn't say any more about it that night, and she didn't ask, because she'd been at enough bedsides to know that when somebody puts a door on the table and doesn't open it, the kindest thing on this earth is to leave it shut. They kept drinking. The fire went down. She told him about the $11 and the 3 nights she'd covered her father, and never told a soul. And he told her, without any heat at all, that he'd been 15 the last time somebody had put their arms around him and meant it. And neither of them said the other thing, the enormous thing, which was that 2 people had just sat in a room and told the truth for the first time in years to somebody they'd known for 6 weeks, and that the truth had cost them nothing, and that neither of them had known such a thing was possible. It was somewhere past 2 when he stood up to go. He said goodnight and turned, and Luciana said his name, and he stopped. She said, "Wait." She crossed the room and she stopped in front of him with about 2 feet between them, and she held out her hand, palm up, slow, well out where he could see the whole distance of it, the way you approach a patient who's been hurt by hands before. She said, "Watch it the whole way in." And she waited. She didn't move. She let him have as long as he needed, and it was a long time, long enough for the fire to settle again. And then Graham Marchetti reached out and pulled the glove off his right hand, and he set his bare palm against hers, and he didn't pull away. Adelaide Kerr came up at 7 with the tray, the way she'd come up at 7 for 6 years, to a room nobody had slept in. And she knocked, and heard a voice say, "Come in," and she opened the door and stopped so hard the china rang. The tray tilted about 4 inches. She caught it against her hip. Graham was in the chair by the window, with a book on his knee and his shirt from the day before, and he'd been there long enough for the fire to have gone out. Luciana was still asleep. Nothing in that room would have shocked a priest. It didn't matter. Adelaide had worked in that house since before the older brother died, and she had heard, the way everybody had heard, and in 1 second at 7 o'clock in the morning, the things she'd been told for years about the man she worked for stopped being true, and she knew it, and he watched her know it. He said, "Good morning," set it down anywhere, and then, in the same voice, he said, "When the boys come in, have my things moved from the west wing into this room." And Adelaide Kerr, who had never in 6 years asked him a question that wasn't about food, said, "All of them, sir." And Graham said, "All of them." She set the tray on the table by the door, and went out and got down the stairs before she let her face do anything. She told no one. She didn't have to. By 10 in the morning, 2 men were carrying garment bags along the East Hall in full view of everybody who worked in that house, and there is no rumor on this earth that survives the sight of a man's shirts going into his wife's closet. Nobody said a word about it. That was the strange part, the part Luciana would remember. There was no whispering, no smirking in doorways, no one caught looking. What went through that house instead was something quieter and much larger, the way a room changes when a fever finally breaks. And by that evening, the 2 young guys at the gate were standing up straighter, and the cook made something that took 4 hours, and Vincent Cardone, who had worked for the family for 19 years and had a face like a closed bank, held a door for her and said "ma'am" in a way that meant it. At breakfast, Graham was already down when she came in. He waited until Adelaide had gone back through the swinging door, and then he said, "Last night was the whiskey." Luciana buttered a piece of toast she had no intention of eating. She said, "Most of it." He said, "The arrangement stands the way it's written. 2 years. Nothing changes." She said, "Of course." And that was that. And neither one of them looked up from the table, and both of them knew the other one was lying, and neither of them had the smallest idea what to do about it. So she did the thing she always did when she couldn't fix a situation. She started watching. It took her 4 days. He wore the gloves at breakfast. He wore them in his own study with the door shut and no one in the room but her. He took them off to eat and put them back on before he stood up, and she began to notice that the taking off and the putting on happened at the same points every single time, like a man checking that a door is locked. When Vincent came in with the mail and passed behind his chair, close, ordinary, the way people move around a table, Graham didn't flinch, because flinching would have been visible. What he did instead was stop breathing. About 3 seconds. Then it started again, and his shoulders came down, and he turned a page. Nobody else in that room saw it. Luciana had spent 9 years watching chests rise and fall for a living. On the 4th morning, a barber came up from the village, an old man with a case, and Graham sat and let him cut his hair, and would not let him near his throat with the razor. And the barber didn't argue, which meant it wasn't the first time, which meant this was a rule the whole world around him had quietly organized itself around, and nobody had ever once said out loud. Luciana stood in the doorway with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands and understood what she was looking at, and it wasn't arrogance. She'd been telling herself for 6 weeks that the man was cold. She'd let herself believe some of it because it made the arrangement simpler. But you don't hold your breath because you think you're better than the person walking behind you. That isn't contempt. She'd seen that face on a soldier in her unit who'd come in for a routine procedure and gone rigid when a tech put a blood pressure cuff on him. She'd seen it on a woman of 80 who couldn't be turned in bed without warning. It was the oldest thing in her profession, and the one nobody ever charts. And it had a name. And the name wasn't arrogance. It was fear. Not the ordinary kind. The kind that lives in the body long after the mind has finished with it. That doesn't care how big a man is, or how many people are afraid of him, or how much of the East Coast he owns. The city called him a monster because he wouldn't shake a hand. And Luciana Sheridan stood in a doorway with cold coffee and thought, no, he wouldn't shake a hand because somebody, a long time ago, taught his body that hands were the thing that hurt. And she thought about the 2 feet of floor between them the night before, and how long he'd looked at her palm before he'd taken the glove off. And she set the coffee down and went to find something useful to do, because she had just realized she was in a great deal of trouble. It started because one of the young men at the gate came up to the kitchen with his hand wrapped in a dish towel, and Adelaide said, "Wait for the doctor. He comes Thursdays," Luciana said. "It's Monday. Let me see it." It was a deep laceration across the base of the thumb, 3 days old, closed with something that wasn't a suture, red for about 1.5 inches around the edges, and warm. She said, "Who put this in?" And the boy said, "Dr. Prine. He was up here Thursday." She cleaned it out at the kitchen sink and told him he'd be starting antibiotics that afternoon, whether the doctor liked it or not. And then she went and found the medical room at the end of the service hall, and that was where it stopped being about a hand. There was a locked cabinet with a key hanging on a nail beside it. Inside were sample boxes with no lot numbers, 3 vials with the labels peeled, a bag of expired saline that had gone amber, and prescription pads, blank ones, 2 of them, in a house, in a cabinet, with the key on a nail. She stood there for a while with the door open, and then she went out to the gate and asked the boy for the doctor's full name, and she wrote it on the back of a receipt. That night she sat on the floor of the bedroom with her laptop and looked him up on the state licensing site, which is public, which takes 4 minutes, which any person in this country can do about any person who claims to treat them. Warren Prine. License revoked. 6 years ago. The disciplinary summary ran to 2 pages, and she read all of it, and then she read the date again, because 6 years was the same, 6 years everybody in that house counted from, the year the older brother died, and she sat back against the bed and thought about that for a long moment before she made herself stop, because she didn't have anything yet, and a nurse who guesses is worse than a nurse who waits. She went to Graham in the study the next morning. She didn't ask permission. She put the printout on his desk and said, "This man hasn't been a doctor since before I finished my degree. He's been coming into your house every Thursday for 6 years. Graham read it. He took his time. Then he said, "Who hired him?" She said, "I don't know. I assumed you did." And Graham said, "No." And that was all he said. He didn't get up, didn't make a call in front of her, didn't tell her he'd handle it. He handed the paper back and said, "What do you want to do?" And Luciana, who had spent her entire professional life asking permission from people who knew less than she did, heard herself say, "I want the room." He said, "Take it." And then he went back to what he was doing, and never once in the 6 weeks that followed did he tell her how. She threw everything in that cabinet into a bag and drove it to a take-back box at a pharmacy in Cold Spring herself, because you don't put that in household trash. She had the room stripped and scrubbed. She bought what belonged in it out of her own money, which she had now, and it took her 3 tries to get used to the fact that she could. Automated defibrillator on the wall by the door. Real oxygen, secured, with a regulator that worked. Bleeding control kit, the kind they teach in every high school in the country now, and a second one at the gatehouse. Glucometer, blood pressure cuffs in 3 sizes, because a cuff that's too small on a big man reads high, and half of medicine is people getting treated for numbers that were never true. And then she started the files. She caught them one at a time, at the kitchen table, 20 minutes each, and she did it the way she'd do it on a unit. Height, weight, blood pressure, both arms, medications, all of them, including the ones people don't count, allergies, family history. Last time you saw a doctor. And if the answer was a shrug, she wrote a shrug. 19 men and women worked on that property, and 11 of them hadn't had blood pressure taken in over 3 years. She found 2 who were hypertensive and didn't know it. She found 1 man of 50 who was diabetic and had been calling it getting older. She sat with him for 40 minutes, and by the end of it he was crying at a kitchen table in front of a woman he'd met 11 days earlier, and she got him to a physician in Peekskill on the Thursday, a real one, with a license she'd checked herself. Vincent Cardone came in last, because Vincent came in last to everything. He sat down across from her with his sleeve already up. She said, "Any medications?" He said, "No." She said, "Mr. Cardone, I've got your file open and you take something for your heart. I can see it in your face." And the man laughed, 1 syllable. The first sound like that she'd ever heard out of him, and told her the truth. When she was done, she said thank you, and he stood up and pushed the chair in and said, "Will there be anything else, ma'am?" And then he stopped and corrected himself, and he said, "Mrs." He'd said ma'am for 11 days the way a man says it to a guest. That was the first time anybody in that house called her Mrs., and meant the other thing by it. The thing that means this is her house too, and she felt it land. Graham watched all of it from the doorway of his own study. He never came in. He never sent anyone to help her, or told anyone to cooperate. And afterward she understood that this had been deliberate, that a man who owned everything for 40 miles had stood back and let his wife earn 19 people the hard way, and that he'd known exactly what he was doing. There was a path along the edge of the property that came out on the bluff about 200 feet above the water, and he walked it most evenings. And one evening, in the 2nd week of October, she walked it with him. They went a long way without talking. Below them, the river had gone, the color of gunmetal, and a barge was working its way down toward the city, taking forever, the way they do. Luciana said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to be able to say no." He said, "Ask." She said, 22 years. You said 22 years, that first night. What happened when you were 15? He didn't answer for about a quarter mile. Then he said, "They took me out of a car on a Tuesday afternoon, 4 blocks from my school." And he said it in the flat voice, the terms of the contract voice, and she understood that this was the only voice he had for it. He said, "They kept me for 9 days. He didn't tell her where. He didn't tell her what they did, or how many of them there were, or what was said, and she didn't ask. And later she'd be glad of that. What he told her instead was smaller and worse. He said, "There was a light bulb, and it was on the whole time, so I stopped knowing what day it was by about the 3rd one. He said, "I could hear water in a pipe." He said, "They came down at no particular hour, and after a while I could tell how many of them were coming by the sound on the stairs, and I'd start shaking before the door opened." He said, "That's the part I couldn't get rid of. Not any of it. Just that, the sound of somebody coming down toward me and not knowing when." She said, "And then," he said, "my father paid on the 9th day. I walked out. I was fine. There wasn't a mark on me that mattered." He said, "Everybody kept telling me how lucky I was, and they were right, and I've never once been able to make that feel true." He said, "Nobody ever suggested I talk to anyone. It wasn't a thing our family did. You had a bad week, and then you were a man about it. And I was fine for about 6 months, and then somebody put a hand on the back of my neck in a restaurant, a friend of my father's, meaning nothing by it, and I put a glass through a window," he said, 15 years old. "And after that I learned to arrange my whole life so it never happened again, and I got extremely good at it, and here I am." Luciana didn't say anything. She'd been at 800 bedsides. She knew what the useless words were. She didn't say, "You poor thing." She didn't say, "That's terrible." She didn't say, "You're safe now," which is the cruelest one, because it isn't a thing anybody can promise. She walked beside him and let it stand in the air, and after a while she said, "Does anybody else know that whole story?" And Graham said, "My brother knew." She waited. He said, "Mateo was 3 years older. He was the one they should have taken. He was the one worth something." And he laughed with nothing in it and said, "He was better at all of it than I'll ever be." People loved him inside of 10 minutes. He walked into a room and the room got warmer. He was 34 when he died. He said, "They called it an overdose." She said, "Was it?" And Graham stopped walking. He said, "That's a strange question." She said, "I've written that word on a chart more times than I can count. And about a third of the time it was true the way people mean it, and the rest of the time it was somebody who took the same thing he'd been taking for 2 years out of a bottle that wasn't the same anymore. And Graham Marchetti looked at her for a long moment on that bluff with the light going, and then he said, 6 years and nobody has ever asked me that. He said, I don't know. I never had anything to ask it with. And then he said, and I sat down in his chair, because there wasn't anybody else, and I've been sitting in it ever since. And every man who works for me knows I never wanted it. That's most of what's wrong with me in their eyes, and the rest they made up. So she asked him the other question, the one she'd been carrying since the fitting room. She said, they made up something specific. They put a name to it. Julian Bright. You've never denied it. Not to them, not to me, not once, and you could end it in a sentence. Why haven't you? And this time he answered straight away, like a man who'd had the answer ready for years and nowhere to put it. He said, because Julian's my friend. He said, if I stand up in front of those people and correct them, then what I'm doing is telling a room full of men that being what they think he is would be the worst thing they could say about me. He said, I'd be handing them my denial with his name still in it. I'd be making the truth about him into an accusation, in public, so I could be comfortable. He said, he's had a harder life than me, and he's never once complained about it. He said, they can call me anything they want. It costs me nothing. It costs him everything. And Luciana stood on that cliff and understood that she had married the most decent man she had ever met, and that the entire city of New York had spent 6 years calling him a monster because he'd chosen to protect somebody quietly instead of loudly, and that not one of them would ever know it. He arrived on the last Friday in October, in the rain, having taken the train to Cold Spring, and then declined a ride on the grounds that he'd wanted to see the station. And he came up the drive on foot, in a wool coat that had absorbed about 9 pounds of water. Julian Bright was 37 years old, and looked like a man who'd been indoors since 1998. He came through the front door with his glasses fogged, a leather case clutched against his chest with both arms, and he stopped dead when one of the dogs came around the corner. He said, "Oh," and went completely still. Vincent took the dog. Julian said, "Thank you. That's very kind. I'm sure he's lovely. I simply have a policy." Then he sneezed 4 times in a row and said, "That'll be the dog, and also possibly the hay." "Is there hay? I'm allergic to a great deal of the countryside." He shook Luciana's hand, noticed halfway through that he was dripping on her floor, apologized for the floor, apologized for the apology, and then saw Vincent's holster as the man turned and went the color of paper. He said, "Does he have to have that in the house?" Luciana said, "He does." Julian said, "Right. Fine. Marvelous. I'll simply stand over here then." And she liked him instantly, entirely, without reservation, which surprised her, because she'd been braced for weeks to meet the man whose name 6 women had put on a table like a card. She'd had the blue room made up 2 days earlier. She'd had the radiator bled because it knocked. She'd put a lamp on the desk with a bulb she'd gone into town for, because he worked in the evenings, and the overhead in that room was useless. And when he walked in and saw it, he stopped in the doorway. She said, "I read about the Aldrich Bible." He turned around. She said, "The water damage in the back third. You've been on it 2 years." He said, "How on earth?" She said, "It was in the paper." And Julian Bright, who had spent his entire adult life being the least interesting person at every table he sat at, put his case down for the first time since the train and said, "Would you like to see the photographs?" So she said yes, and that was the mistake. And for the next 3 days, Ironwood was not a fortress on a cliff. It was a house with 2 men arguing in it. They argued about paper. They argued about whether the 18th century binder had used a wove stock or a laid one, and whether it mattered. They argued about iron gall ink, which Luciana learned eats the very page it's written on, slowly, over centuries, so that the words go on destroying their own paper long after everybody who wrote them is dead. And she thought that was the most beautiful and terrible thing she'd heard all year and said so. And Julian pointed at her with a piece of toast and said, "Thank you. Graham thinks it's a maintenance problem." Graham said, "It is a maintenance problem." Julian said, "It's a tragedy." Graham said, "It's a tragedy you get paid for." And they went on like that. She sat with them because she liked it, and because sitting with them meant she got to watch her husband turn into somebody 20 years younger. A man who interrupted, who leaned in, who laughed with his head back once at something so stupid she couldn't repeat it afterward. Once, Julian, mid-sentence, reached over and put a hand on Graham's forearm, and Graham didn't stop breathing. Luciana saw it happen and understood what she was looking at. 22 years of arrangement, and one exception, made a long time ago, at 16. On the third night, the argument had gone to weight and thickness, and Julian was insisting he could tell a stock by hand alone. And Graham said, "You can't." And Julian said, "I can. I've a very good hand. Ask anyone." And Graham said, "Ask who?" And Julian said, "Ask anybody who's ever seen me work. Ask the woman in the Bronx." It went by so fast. Luciana's cup stopped about 4 inches off the table. She said, "Ask who?" And Julian said, And then he heard himself. She watched him hear himself. Watched the whole thing arrive on his face in stages. The way a man watches a glass go off the edge of a counter and can't reach it. He said, "I've said something." Graham said, "Julian?" Julian said, "No, I have, haven't I? I've said something." And Luciana put the cup down very carefully and said, "What woman in the Bronx?" Nobody answered. She said, "Julian." And Julian Bright, who could not lie, who had never in 37 years successfully lied to anybody, took his glasses off and cleaned them on his sleeve and said, 14 months ago. She waited. He said, "He was shot." Luciana said, "When?" He said, "The 14th of August, a year ago August. It was a Thursday." He said, "I was the one who drove him, which was an error. I'm a poor driver. I'd had a glass of wine." He said, "We couldn't go anywhere that would have to file. So we went to the emergency room at the public hospital and gave a name that wasn't his, and I sat in a plastic chair for 6 hours, and I have never been so frightened in my life." And Graham didn't say a word. He was watching his wife across the table, and his face had gone completely still. And Luciana wasn't looking at either of them anymore, because the room had dropped away from her, and she was somewhere else entirely. August, a Thursday, the 14th. She got there before Julian did. That was the thing she'd think about afterward, that her body remembered it before her mind agreed to. There'd been a man on a Thursday night in August with a gunshot wound to the left flank, and a name on the board that didn't match anything about him, and no wallet, and no story, and a friend in the waiting room who kept standing up and sitting down. He'd come in bleeding badly, and the trauma bay was full, actually full. 2 motor vehicle collisions off the parkway, and she'd put both hands on him and leaned her whole weight down and held pressure for 40 minutes while they cleared a room. 40 minutes is a long time. You run out of things to say in the first 4. And she remembered, because you don't forget it, that the man had not made one sound, not a word, not a groan, nothing, just gray and sweating and looking at the ceiling. And she'd talked to him the entire time the way she talked to all of them, telling him what she was doing, telling him he was doing fine, and at some point his eyes had come over and stopped on her face and stayed there. She hadn't asked him a single question, not who did it, not why the name on the board was fake, not what he did for a living, because at 3 a.m. in a public hospital in the Bronx, none of that is the job. And afterward, 2 days afterward, an envelope had come to the unit with her name on it and cash in it, thick, more than she made in 3 months, and she had walked it down to the business office and made them log it and give her a receipt, and then she'd gone back upstairs and finished her shift and never told anybody, because there was no version of telling it that didn't sound like bragging. She said, out loud, "In that dining room, it was the left side." And Julian stopped talking. Graham said, "Yes." She said, "You didn't make a sound for 40 minutes. He said, "No." She said, "I sent the money back." And Graham Marchetti said, "I know. I have the receipt." Julian Bright looked from one of them to the other, and then picked up his glass, and got up and left the room with his case, which was, Luciana thought later, the single most tactful thing anyone did that entire year. She sat there. She said, "So it wasn't luck?" He said, "No." She said, "In the restaurant I asked you why me, and you said, because I looked at you, and I wasn't afraid, and I wasn't curious. And I asked you when, and you said I'd find out." He said, "I did say that." And she said, "You'd been looking for me for 14 months. And he said, 11. It took me 3 to find out who you were, because you'd charted under initials. And then it took another 8 to have a reason to come to you that wasn't insane." And Luciana, who had been holding something in her chest since the fitting room without knowing what to call it, felt it turn over. She said, "Then here's my question, and don't manage me. You could have paid off my father in an afternoon and never seen me again. You could have written a check for Danny's care and gone back to your life. You bought 2 years of me. Why? And Graham didn't answer with words. He got up and went to the study and came back with a folder that was old, cloth-bound, with a lawyer's seal on the corner, and he put it on the table in front of her and said, 4 people have seen this. 2 of them are attorneys and 1 of them is dead. She opened it. It was the trust. She read the first 2 pages twice, and then she found the paragraph, and it was 3 lines long, and it was written in the dry language of men in a room in 1979 who never imagined how it would feel to read it. The control of the family holdings passed by blood. If the sitting principal died without a wife and without a child of his body, control moved to the eldest surviving male relative by blood. She read the name typed in beside that clause, Salvatore Renzi. She put her hand flat on the page. Graham said, "My father wrote it that way to keep it out of court. It's been sitting there for 45 years and nobody's ever had to look at it. Because Matteo had a wife and Matteo was going to have children. And then Matteo died, and I sat down in the chair, and I've been the only thing standing between that paragraph and my uncle for 6 years," she said. "And he knows." He said, he wrote a memorandum. He held up 2 fingers, an inch apart. He said, "That thick." Concerns regarding the principal's fitness circulated to the other men, very respectful, very sad. My private conduct, my refusal to appear at things, my unwillingness to marry, at 37, with no explanation offered. He said, "The rumor's in there, Luciana, not stated, implied, in the way that can't be answered. He's been building a case for 2 years that I'm not a whole man and therefore not a fit one. And the whole case rests on the thing I've never denied." And Luciana Sheridan sat in a dining room in a stone house above the Hudson and understood, finally, all of it, that he hadn't married her to dispose of a debt, that every kindness had also been a move, that the rumor he'd carried to protect his friend was the exact rope his uncle had spent 2 years weaving into a noose, and that somewhere out there, a heavy-set man with a bakery box had kissed her cheek and called her daughter. Sal came up on the 2nd Sunday in November, and he brought food, because he always brought food, 3 bags of it from a place on Arthur Avenue, and he carried it into the kitchen himself, and told Adelaide to sit down, which she didn't. He kissed Luciana on the cheek. He said, "Look at her. She's got color in her face. The country agrees with you, sweetheart." And she smiled at him, and felt something cold go down the back of her neck, and she thought, "I have to be exactly the same woman I was in October, or he'll know inside of 5 minutes." So she was. She poured his wine and asked after his knee, and laughed at the story about the cousin in Yonkers. And Graham sat at the head of the table and said almost nothing, which was normal, which helped. Sal talked for an hour without saying anything at all, and then he set his fork down and said, "So, any news?" Luciana said, "News," and Sal spread his hands and made a warm, embarrassed face, the face of a man apologizing for being sentimental. He said, "Don't make me say it. A man my age, at a table with a young couple." He said, "Your mother-in-law would have been asking you since the week after the wedding. God rest her." And Luciana laughed and said, "It's been 6 weeks, Uncle Sal." And he said, 6 weeks is 6 weeks. And then he said, "Still." And he let it sit for a beat too long. "Still. You'd want to get on with it, wouldn't you? At your age. At his." And he said it so kindly. That was the thing. There was nothing in his voice a person could point to. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with sauce on his napkin asking after grandchildren he'd never have. And if she hadn't read 3 lines of a 1979 trust document 4 days earlier, she'd have found it touching. She said, "We're not in any hurry." And Sal said, "No, of course you're not," and picked his fork back up. And that was the whole exchange, 20 seconds of it, and it left a mark on the room that nobody acknowledged for the rest of the night. His driver ate in the kitchen. Luciana went through twice, once for the bread and once for nothing. And both times she looked at him without appearing to, because she'd been looking at people without appearing to for 9 years. He was maybe 40. He'd taken his jacket off and rolled his sleeves, and he was eating with the particular slowness of a man who isn't hungry and knows he ought to be. She'd seen it every week of her working life. His pupils, that was the first thing. 2 black points in a dim kitchen where anybody else's eyes would have opened up. And she stood at the counter with her back half turned and thought, "That isn't tired. That's not what tired looks like." Then he reached across for the salt, and she saw the inside of his forearm, and the way he was scratching at it without noticing, the way you scratch at something that itches from underneath. And she saw the color of him, and how he'd got dinner down but hadn't got much of it down, and she added it up, standing at a counter with a bread knife in her hand, and got an answer she didn't want. This wasn't a man on a bender. This was long. This was months, maybe years. And it was steady, which meant it was supplied, which meant it was written. Because the ones who buy it on a corner don't look like that at 40. They look worse, faster. The ones who look like that have paper. He got up to bring his plate to the sink, and something came out of his jacket pocket with the sleeve, and went onto the floor. A small card, face up. He didn't notice. Luciana bent and picked it up, and read it in the second and a half, before she handed it back. Creamstock. A green cross. Hudson Valley Pain and Wellness. 3 locations. And beneath the locations, in italic, the line "No referral necessary. All major plans accepted." And beneath that, "Walk-in hours 7 days." She gave it to him and said, "You dropped this." And he said, "Thanks," and put it back in his pocket without looking at it, and went out to warm up the car. She stood in that kitchen for a long moment. 3 locations, 7 days a week, no referral. She thought about the 4 counties north of the city and how many people lived in them, and she thought about what a pain clinic looks like when it's real. 1 office, a wait list, a doctor who makes you come back in a month before she'll write anything. And then she thought about what one looks like when it isn't. Sal was in the hall, putting his coat on and saying something to Graham about a cousin's confirmation in the spring. He called back to her, "Thank you for dinner, sweetheart." And he came and took both her hands in both of his the way he had the first time, and he said, "You take care of him." And Luciana Sheridan looked into the face of a man who had been kind to her when nobody else was, who had put a bakery box on a counter and made a room full of women glad. And she said, "I will," and she meant it in a way he didn't hear. Then she stood at the window and watched the taillights go down the drive, and she thought about 3 blank prescription pads in a locked cabinet with the key hanging on a nail beside it. She still had her badge. That was the thing nobody had thought about. Not Sal, not the lawyers, not anyone. That a woman who marries out of a job on a Wednesday is still on the roster on the Thursday. And Luciana had never resigned. She'd taken a leave. So on the Tuesday she drove down to the Bronx at 6 in the morning and sat at a workstation in a records office she'd sat in 400 times, and she pulled the 3 of them. She didn't have to look up the dates. That was the part she'd carry. A man of 31 in March. A woman of 26 in June, who'd been a school aide, whose sister had come in still wearing a lanyard. A man of 44 in September, on a Sunday, and she had been the one to call it, and she had written the time herself in her own handwriting because the resident's pen had run dry. She'd stood next to all 3 of them at the end. She'd put her hands on all 3 of them. And now she sat with their charts open and went past the parts she already knew, past the labs and the notes and the pronouncements, into the intake pages, into the sad clerical back end of a death, where somebody's belongings get itemized and somebody's medication list gets reconciled by a clerk at 4 in the morning. And there it was on all 3. Not the same doctor. 3 different names, 3 different prescriber numbers, 3 different signatures. Same clinic. Hudson Valley Pain and Wellness, one of 3 locations, listed as the origin of a prescription filled within the previous 11 days. 3 out of 3. She sat back in that chair and the room got very quiet in the way rooms do when you've stopped hearing them. 3 isn't a coincidence and 3 also isn't a case. She knew that, so she spent the next 6 hours doing what she was actually good at, which was not detective work. It was the other thing, the boring thing, the thing that wins arguments in hospitals. She counted. The prescription monitoring data in this state is public in the aggregate, county by county, and any person can pull it. And she pulled 4 years of it. She got the census figures for the same counties. Then she sat with a legal pad and did long division like a woman balancing a checkbook. The 3 clinics, together, in one county of 90,000 people, were writing at a volume that would have been high for a county of 800,000. Not double, not triple. She checked her own arithmetic 4 times because she didn't believe it, and it kept coming out the same. And she finally wrote the ratio at the bottom of the page and put her pen down and looked at it. Then she went and found who owned them. That took an afternoon, and a lawyer's clerk who owed her nothing and helped her anyway. The clinics were held by a management company. The management company was owned by a holding company registered in Delaware. The holding company had 1 asset and 1 address. And the address was a building in Yonkers. and the building in Yonkers was leased from a construction firm, and the construction firm was a subsidiary of Marchetti Holdings. 4 steps. It took 4 steps to walk from a woman of 26 dead in June to her husband's name on a certificate of incorporation, and Luciana sat in a parked car outside a courthouse in White Plains and understood exactly what she was looking at. Sal hadn't hidden it. That was the whole design. He'd built the entire thing on Marchetti paper, under the Marchetti umbrella, so that every prescription written, every dollar moved, every person who went down in a stairwell with a photocopy of an intake form in their file, all of it ran uphill toward one name, and it wasn't his. He'd spent 2 years writing a memorandum about a man's fitness with one hand. With the other, he'd been building the thing that would put him in a federal courtroom for the rest of his life. And whichever way it broke, Salvatore Renzi ended up in the chair. If the memorandum worked, he took it. If it didn't, the indictment came and took Graham off the board, and he took it anyway. She drove home doing 55 in the right lane the entire way because her hands weren't steady. It was dark when she got in. She didn't go and find him. She went down the service hall to the room she'd stripped and scrubbed and stocked with her own money, and she shut the door, and she stood there for a minute, with the lights off. She'd been counting something else for the last 9 days. In the back of her head, underneath all of it, the way a nurse counts without deciding to. 6 weeks, then 7, then 8, and nothing. And she'd told herself it was the move, and the hours, and the fact that she'd stopped working nights. She turned the light on. There was a box in the second drawer with the rest of the diagnostics she'd bought in September, still sealed, because she'd stocked that room for 19 other people, and not for herself. She read the instructions all the way through, even though she'd read them 100 times over other women's shoulders. Then she sat on the edge of the exam table in a stone house above the Hudson at 9 o'clock at night, alone, with the door shut, and waited 3 minutes by the clock on the wall, and it was positive. She told him in the study, standing up, still in her coat. She said it plainly because there wasn't a soft way, and she'd never had any use for the soft way. Graham was at the desk with a pen in his hand, and he set it down and didn't move for about 4 seconds. And what came onto his face wasn't joy. She'd been braced for joy, or for the flat nothing he did instead of joy, and what she got was a man going white around the mouth. He said, "Oh God." He said it quietly, the way you say it at the bottom of a stairwell. Then he stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, and she watched his shoulders working, and she said, "Say it." And Graham said, "Do you understand what you're carrying?" She said, "I understand exactly what I'm carrying. I read the document. A child of your body ends the clause." He said, "Permanently." She said, "Yes." He said, "So as of tonight there is nothing between my uncle and that chair except 2 people, and one of them is you." And she saw him arrive at the rest of it, the arithmetic he'd been avoiding since the day he signed the license, and he turned around and said, "He's got 8 months. 8 months and he loses it forever, and the 2 years he's spent on that memorandum are worth nothing, and he knows he can't win a fitness argument against a man with a wife and a baby." He said, "He has to move now. He has to move before that child is born, and there's no version of moving that doesn't come at you." She said, "Then we move first." And Graham Marchetti, who had read out the terms of her whole life in a closed restaurant without blinking, put both hands flat on the windowsill because he needed them somewhere. Frank Sheridan came up the drive 2 days later, in a car she didn't know, and they led him as far as the front hall, because Vincent knew the name and hadn't been told otherwise. Luciana came down and stopped 6 feet from her own father. She said, "You're not supposed to be here. That was a condition. That was in writing." He said, "Lucy." He looked worse than the diner. He had the shakes in one hand and he'd shaved badly, and he said, "I've got about 4 minutes before somebody notices this car isn't where it's supposed to be, so let me talk." She let him. He said, "A man came to me 3 weeks ago." He said, "He told me the marriage isn't going to hold." He said, "There's paper coming, federal paper, and when it lands on your husband and everybody standing next to him." And I said, "That's my daughter you're talking about." And he said, "That's why I'm telling you." And Frank reached into his coat and put something on the hall table. It was small and black, and about the size of a book of matches. He said, "All it does is sit there, under the desk, behind the drawer, anywhere in that room, and it does the rest by itself, and it goes on for 11 days. He said, "You don't have to do anything but put it down." He said, "And then you come out of this clean, Lucy. You're the wife who cooperated. Nobody in this world would blame you for walking away from a man like that. Nobody. He said, I'm trying to save you. He said it, and Luciana believed that he believed it, and that was somehow the worst part. She picked it up. It was lighter than it looked. She stood there holding it, and she thought about $11, and a 9-minute voicemail, and a photocopy wedged in a doorframe at eye level so that she couldn't pretend she hadn't seen it, and how the men in this life never came at you with a fist. They came at you with an envelope, and a kindness, and a reason. She walked past him into the front room where the fire was going. She didn't crush it. She didn't stamp on it or throw it. She held it out over the grate and opened her fingers, and it dropped into the coals, and the plastic went soft, and then went blue for a second, and then stopped being anything. Her father said her name from the doorway. She turned around and said, Get out of this house. He said, Lucy, listen to me. She said, Get out, and don't come back, and don't call me. And I want you to hear this part because I'm only saying it once. If anything happens to my brother, anything, I will know which side of it you were standing on. And Frank Sheridan opened his mouth and closed it and left, and she heard the car turn around on the gravel, and then she heard nothing. She was still standing at the fireplace when Graham came in. He'd been outside. He came through the doorway with his coat over his arm, and he stopped, because he could smell it, that particular smell of a thing burning that was never meant to burn. He looked at the grate. There was still a corner of it holding its shape in the coals, black and curled, unmistakably not wood. He looked at it for a long moment. And then Graham Marchetti did the thing that Luciana would still be thinking about years later, on ordinary afternoons, for no reason at all. He didn't ask. He put his coat over the back of the chair and came and stood beside her at the fire and said nothing whatsoever. And after a while she said, They want to find a monster in this house. She said, I'll show them one. It came on a Tuesday morning, and it came on paper. No cars in the drive, no men at the gate, nothing anybody could have stood in front of. A federal seizure warrant, executed at 9 o'clock, freezing every account held by Marchetti Holdings and its subsidiaries, pending an ongoing investigation into the distribution of controlled substances through a network of clinics in 4 counties, 19 accounts. Payroll, operations, the construction contracts, all of it, shut in an hour by a clerk with a keyboard. And Luciana, reading the notice over Graham's shoulder in the study, understood the shape of it before he said a word. Sal hadn't waited. He'd walked it in himself, or somebody had walked it in for him, and every name on that warrant was a Marchetti name, and his own wasn't anywhere on it, because it had never been anywhere on anything. She was at the hospital that afternoon. Not her hospital, the transplant center, up in Westchester, for Danny's monthly. And she'd been in the corridor outside the clinic with a cup of coffee she'd bought, and not touched when her phone went. It was the financial coordinator, a woman she liked, a woman who had called her 4 times in 6 weeks, with nothing but good news. Luciana knew from the first syllable of her name. The woman said, I need to tell you something, and I want you to hear all of it before you react. She said, The funding source on your brother's file was flagged this morning. She said, The account the guarantee is drawn on is subject to a federal seizure order, and we have no ability to draw against it, and no way to know when we will. And Luciana said, So we'll change the payer. And the coordinator said, There isn't time for that today, and I'm so sorry, but the Financial Review Board met at 1 o'clock, and your brother has been moved to inactive status. Luciana said, Inactive. The woman said, He stays on the list. He keeps his accrued time. He keeps his place. But while he's inactive, he isn't eligible to receive an offer. If a heart comes up tonight that matches him, it goes past him to the next person, and he never knows it existed. And Luciana Sheridan, who had told 100 families worse things than that in corridors exactly like the one she was standing in, felt her knees stop working. She went down against the wall, slowly, with the phone still at her ear, and sat on the floor of a hospital corridor in Westchester, with her back against the cold tile and her legs out in front of her like a child, while people walked past and looked and kept walking, and she heard herself say, Thank you for calling me yourself, because even then, even down there, the manners held. She didn't cry. She wanted to. She sat on that floor for 11 minutes and thought about the fact that there was no one to fight. Nobody had touched her brother. Nobody had gone near him. Nobody had made a call or a threat, or so much as raised a voice. And a 16-year-old boy in an apartment in the Bronx was going to sit there with his phone on the nightstand, waiting for a call that would now go to somebody else. and he wouldn't even know the difference, and that was the most obscene thing about it. It was all legal, every step. A warrant, a review board, a line changed in a database from one word to another word. That was how these men did it, not with hands, with paper, at a distance, so that afterward everybody could look you in the face and say they'd done nothing at all. She got home at 7. Graham was standing in the front hall with his coat already on and Vincent behind him with the car keys, and she knew before she'd shut the door. She said, "Where are you going?" He said, "Into the city. There's a woman at the United States Attorney's Office named Karen Whitlock, and she's been waiting 6 years for me to walk through her door." He said, "If I go in and I proffer, the seizure comes off the operating accounts inside of a week, maybe less." He said, "They don't want the buildings, they want a name." And Luciana said, "They want yours." He said, "They'll take mine." She said, "And then what?" And Graham said, "And then my wife has a bank account that works, and her brother goes back on the active list, and that's the whole of it. That's all I'm buying." He wasn't posturing. That was what frightened her. There was no heat in it at all. He was a man reading out terms again, the same flat voice as the closed restaurant in October, a man who had decided the price and was on his way to pay it. Luciana crossed the hall and stood between her husband and the door. She said, "No." He said, "Luciana." She said, "Listen to me. Every man in this story has tried to solve it the only way he knows. My father tried to fix a hole with more of what dug it. Your uncles spent 6 years doing it with paper. And now you're going to walk into a federal building and hand them your life, because that's your version of the same thing. And it won't work, because they don't want you. They want the case, and the case is still going to be sitting there tomorrow with your name on it." She said, "He built it on your paper. He used your company and your name and your reputation, and it looks like you from every angle. And there's exactly one person on this earth who can take it apart, and it isn't the man with the guns." She put her hand flat on his chest, over the coat, and she said it. "Not you. You've got guns. I've got their charts." It took her 4 days and 1 form. Next of kin can request a full autopsy report in this state, toxicology included. And Graham signed it at the kitchen table without asking her what she expected to find, and the office of the medical examiner mailed it out like they mail out anything, in a plain envelope, 11 pages. She read it twice at the kitchen table, and then she sat very still for about a minute. Then she called the man at the state lab she'd been calling all week, the one who ran comparison work for overdose clusters, and she read him the analyte panel line by line, and she said, "Tell me if that's a match to the 3 I sent you." And he said, "Hang on." And then he said, "Where did you get this one?" She said, 6 years ago. And he said, "Then somebody's been selling out of the same supply for 6 years." And Sal came up on the Sunday, because they invited him. Every capo in the family came, 11 men around the long table at Ironwood. And Salvatore Renzi took the seat at the far end without being told to. And nobody said a word about it, because with a federal seizure on the accounts and the principal's name on the warrant, everyone in that room understood what the meeting was for. Graham sat at the head and said nothing. Sal did the talking. He was gentle about it. He said, "Nobody's happy to be here." He said, "This is a family, and families have hard nights." And then he looked down the table at Luciana and put his hand over his heart. He said, "Sweetheart, I want to say this in front of everybody so it's said out loud. You didn't sign up for this. You're a nurse, for God's sake. You came from a normal life, and you got pulled into something that was already going wrong before you got here. And there's not a man at this table who'd hold it against you if you wanted to go home." He said, "You say the word and I'll drive you myself." And there was a murmur, and 1 or 2 of them nodded, because it was a decent thing to say. Then he let a beat go by and he said, "And I want to be fair to him." He said, "I've known that boy since he was born." He said, "But there are things a man is supposed to be able to do in this life, and he can't. And we've all watched him not do them for 6 years, and we all agreed not to say it." He said, "Look at him. He can't even shake your hand." And that was the moment. Luciana Sheridan stood up. She had a plain folder in front of her, and she opened it. And she didn't raise her voice once. Not one time. Not through any of it. She said, "This is the prescription monitoring data for 4 counties, 4 years, and beside it is the census. 90,000 people. The 3 clinics in that county wrote at a volume you'd expect in a county of 800,000. That's the first page, and you can check it yourselves tomorrow. It's public. She turned the page. She said, "These are 3 people." She said their names. She said their ages, 31, 26, 44. She said the month each of them died, and then she said the times. And she said, "I know the times, because I was standing next to all 3 of them, and I wrote the last one down myself, because the resident's pen was empty." She said, "Every one of them had a prescription in the file from a walk-in clinic, 3 locations, no referral necessary." She turned the page. She said, "The clinics are owned by a management company. The management company is owned by a holding company in Delaware. The holding company leases from a construction firm, and the construction firm is a subsidiary of Marchetti Holdings, which is why the warrant came here on Tuesday, and not somewhere else." She looked down the table. She said, 4 steps. "It took me 1 afternoon." And Sal said, "And none of that has anything to do with me, sweetheart." And Luciana said, "No." "So here's the last page." She took the 11-page report out and set it down, and she said, "This is the toxicology on Matteo Marchetti, 6 years ago." And the room changed. She said, "I had it compared against the 3 I just read you. It's the same supply, same analytes, same profile, 6 years apart." She said, "Whoever was selling it in 2019 is who's been selling it since, and it went out through those clinics, and it went out under this family's name." She let that sit for exactly as long as it needed. Then she said, "So I'll tell you what I think happened, and any man here can tell me I'm wrong. I think you built it, and it got away from you. And one Saturday night, it went to somebody you never intended it to reach, and you didn't know until this minute, and you have sat at his memorial every single year for 6 years." She said, "I don't think you meant to kill your nephew, Mr. Renzi. I think you killed him with paperwork and never once had to look at it." And Salvatore Renzi sat at the far end of the table, and his face came apart in a way that no man in that room ever forgot. And he said, "That's not," and stopped, and didn't finish it. Nobody moved. Then Luciana closed the folder and said the thing that ended it. She said, "All of you have called my husband a monster for 6 years because he won't touch anybody." She said, "That man touched 40,000 people a month with a prescription pad." Graham had not moved once. He stood at the head of the table with his arms crossed and let his wife finish. And afterward he said that not stepping in was the hardest thing he'd ever done in his life. One by one, the men turned their chairs. Vincent walked Sal out to a car and put him in it, and nobody laid a hand on him. And the following Thursday, the copies went downtown to an assistant United States attorney named Karen Whitlock, who read them for 2 hours without speaking. He stepped down in January. He did it in a room with 11 men and a lawyer, and it took under an hour. And afterward, the construction and the waste hauling and the 2 shopping centers in Rockland went on being exactly what they'd always been on paper. A legitimate company with a payroll and a tax return, and everything else that had been quietly attached to them for 40 years came off and fell apart on its own, because it turned out it had only ever been held together by one family's willingness to hold it. Some of those men never spoke to him again. Vincent Cardone stayed. He said, "Somebody's got to drive, Mrs." And that was the entire conversation. The seizure came off the operating accounts in 9 days once Karen Whitlock had what she had, and on the 10th day the transplant center moved Danny Sheridan back to active status. And 41 days after that, at 2 in the morning on a Thursday, the phone rang. Luciana sat in a surgical waiting room for 7 hours. She'd sat in 100 of them from the other side. She'd been the one who came out and told families, and she'd always thought she understood what that chair was like. And she'd been wrong. Completely wrong, and she'd never say a careless thing to a family in a waiting room again for the rest of her working life. At the 4th hour, she walked out into the corridor because she couldn't be in that room anymore. It was full. Shift change, visiting hours, a hallway of strangers going both directions, carts, a man on a phone, somebody's grandmother in a wheelchair. Graham came and stood next to her. He didn't say anything because there wasn't anything, and then he reached over and took her hand. Out there, in front of all of them. He'd taken the glove off first, and she hadn't seen him do it, and he held her hand in the middle of a crowded corridor in a public hospital, with people brushing past on both sides, and he didn't let go, and he didn't stop breathing, and Luciana Sheridan stood there and finally, after 8 years and 1 month, cried, quietly, the way you do when it's over. Her father came back in the spring, because they do. He stood in the front hall and asked for $11,000. She said no. Then she said, "There's a residential program in Rhinebeck, 90 days. Inpatient. And it's paid for. It's been paid for since February. And the bed is there whenever you want it. And there's a job in receiving at the hospital. Loading dock, 6 in the morning. And it's yours the day you finish, and not one day before. She said, "That's what there is. There's no money, Dad. There will never be money." And Frank Sheridan looked at his daughter for a long moment and said, "That's a hard way to do it, Lucy." And she said, "I know." And he left. And it was 14 months before he took the bed, and she never once went back on the terms. 2 years later, there's a sign at the end of the drive at Ironwood, and the room at the end of the service hall is a free community clinic, 3 days a week. No appointment, no insurance question, no charge, run by a nurse practitioner named Luciana Marchetti, who finished her degree with a baby on her hip and graduated at 30. Danny's 20, and he goes to college in Poughkeepsie. And he has a scar down his sternum he'll show anybody who asks. Julian comes up most months, still allergic to the countryside, and he brings his partner, a quiet man who restores clocks, and Adelaide sets 4 places without being asked, and nobody at that table has ever once had to explain themselves. And on a Saturday in June, a little girl of 2 years old came running down the front hall at full speed, and Graham Marchetti got down on both knees on the stone floor and let her put her arms around his neck and hold on. They pitied her once. They stood in a fitting room off Madison and decided what a man was based on nothing at all, and they pitied the woman going to him. Not one of them ever knew that they were looking at the most decent person any of them would meet. What this story leaves us with is simple enough. People will always invent an explanation for what they don't understand, and then repeat it until it sounds like the truth. And the cost of that is always paid by somebody who never gets a hearing. Some wounds don't show on the skin, and the only thing that finds them is patience. And the measure of a person was never what was whispered about them. It was how they treated the people who couldn't do anything for them. If this story moved you, please like it, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next one. We'd love to know how it landed with you, so tell us in the comments. Has someone in your own life ever been judged for something that simply wasn't true? And what did it take for the truth to come out? We read every one of them. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end, and we wish you good health, peace, and quiet joy in your days. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you in the next video.